The dust-coated horizon swallowed the last sliver of sunlight as Xander Graves pushed his exhausted stallion toward home, the weight of 3 sleepless days heavy on his shoulders. The cattle drive to Abilene had been brutal, but the thought of Katherine winters waiting for him at the small homestead they'd built together kept him upright in the saddle despite his body's desperate pleas for rest. The year was 1878, and the Wyoming Territory offered little mercy to those who sought to tame it. The promise of open land had brought Xander west 5 years earlier, a 22-year-old man with nothing but determination and the skills he'd learned working his uncle's ranch in Texas. Now at 27, he had a small spread of his own, a herd that was slowly growing, and a wife whose absence ached in his chest like a physical wound whenever he was forced to leave. As night fully claimed the prairie, a distant pinprick of golden light appeared on the horizon, growing steadily brighter as he approached. Katherine had kept her promise, leaving a lantern burning in the window to guide him home through the darkness. The simple act of devotion brought a lump to his throat. Katherine stood at the window, her slender fingers nervously adjusting the wick of the lantern for the 5th time that hour. 24 years old, with honey-brown hair that cascaded past her shoulders when not pinned up as it was now, she pressed her palm against the cool glass and peered into the darkness. Xander was 3 days late. She told herself there were 100 innocent explanations: delays at the cattle yards, bad weather further north, a lame horse, but her mind conjured 1,000 tragedies instead. Life in the Wyoming Territory demanded resilience from women as much as men. Katherine had learned that lesson quickly after arriving 2 years ago as a mail-order bride, driven west by the suffocating confines of her family's expectations in Boston and the promise of a different life. She'd expected hardship, isolation, perhaps even disappointment in the man who would become her husband. What she hadn't expected was to fall so completely in love with Xander Graves, a man whose quiet strength and unwavering kindness had revealed themselves slowly, like water gradually wearing away stone. The soft whinny of a horse broke through the night's silence, and Katherine's heart leaped to her throat. She grabbed her shawl and rushed outside, lantern in hand, its light casting long shadows across the yard as she moved. "Xander." She called, her voice carrying across the open space between the cabin and the approaching rider. "It's me, Katie," came the weary reply, the deep, familiar voice sending relief flooding through her veins. She watched as he dismounted stiffly, his movements lacking their usual fluid grace. Even in the dim lantern light, she could see the exhaustion etched into his face, the way his broad shoulders sagged beneath his duster. "You're late," she said softly, not in accusation but in concern. "I was worried." Xander took off his hat, revealing dark hair matted with sweat and trail dust. His blue eyes, usually bright with quiet humor, were bloodshot and heavy-lidded. "Trouble south of Casper," he explained, leading his horse toward the small barn. "Rustlers hit a few spreads, took the long way around just to be safe." Katherine nodded, falling into step beside him. "Let me take care of Thunder. You look dead on your feet." He started to protest, but stopped when she gave him a pointed look. 5 years of hard ranching had built Katherine's confidence and strength in ways her Boston upbringing never could have. She knew how to handle livestock as well as any man, a fact that had initially surprised Xander but now filled him with quiet pride. "There's stew keeping warm," she said, taking the reins from his calloused hands, "and I'll heat water for a bath after I settle Thunder." Xander caught her hand, his thumb tracing a gentle path across her knuckles. "I missed you something fierce, Katie." The simple declaration, spoken in his exhaustion-roughened voice, warmed her more than any fire could. She reached up, brushing trail dust from his cheek. "Welcome home, Cowboy." Later, with Xander washed, fed, and settled into their bed, Katherine curled beside him, listening to his steady breathing. The cattle drive had brought enough money to see them through the coming winter and purchase supplies they desperately needed, but each time he left, the separation grew harder to bear. "What are you thinking about so hard?" Xander murmured, surprising her. She thought he was already asleep. "Just glad you're home safe," she answered, nestling closer to his side, his arm tightened around her. I've been thinking, Katie, this might be the last long drive I take for a while. She propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face in the faint glow of the banked fire. What do you mean? The railroad's pushing closer. Soon we might be able to load cattle at Potter's Creek, just a day's ride from here. His fingers absently traced patterns on her shoulder, and with what we made on this drive, we could buy some breeding stock from Old Man Henderson. Build our herd here instead of driving them so far. Hope fluttered in Katherine's chest, but she tempered it with practicality. Can we afford that? Xander nodded slowly. I think so. Especially if, he hesitated, then continued. Especially if we take on that mail contract I mentioned before I left. 3 days a week carrying post between here and Medicine Bow. Katherine bit her lip. The mail contract would mean regular income, something rare and precious for small ranchers like them, but it would also mean Xander riding out regularly, often in dangerous weather. It's not the same as being gone for weeks, he said, reading her concern. I'd leave at dawn and be home by supper, even in winter. And the ranch, we hire help. Just one man at first. That Peterson boy is turning 18 next month, and his pa says he's itching for work of his own. Katherine considered this, thinking of young Thomas Peterson, who'd helped with their spring branding the past 2 years. A good worker, honest and respectful. We could build something real here, Katie, Xander continued, a quiet intensity in his voice despite his exhaustion. Something that lasts. She leaned down to kiss him softly. We already have. The next morning, Katherine woke to find Xander's side of the bed empty. Sunlight streamed through the curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks, transforming the simple cabin into a warm, golden sanctuary. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find her husband at the corral, inspecting Thunder's hooves with methodical care. I thought you'd sleep until noon at least, she called, crossing the yard toward him. Xander looked up with a smile that softened the hard lines of his face. Clean-shaven now, with his dark hair still damp from washing, he looked younger, more like the man who'd met her stagecoach 2 years ago with nervous hands and earnest eyes. Old habits, he replied, patting Thunder's flank. Besides, there's work needs doing. Katherine nodded, understanding. The ranch never stopped demanding attention, no matter how weary its caretakers. Breakfast first, she insisted, taking his arm. Work will wait that long. Over plates of salt pork and cornbread, they planned the day ahead. There were fence posts to mend, a loose board on the barn to nail down before the autumn winds came in earnest, preserves to put up from the garden's late harvest. The rhythm of ranch life, demanding but predictable in its own way. I thought I might ride over to the Petersons this afternoon, Xander said, draining his coffee cup. Talk to Thomas about working for us if you're agreeable. Katherine nodded. I am. It's a good plan, Xander. She hesitated, then added, I've been thinking about what you said last night. About building something that lasts. His eyes, clear blue in the morning light, fixed on her with quiet intensity. And I'd like that very much, she said softly. A future here together, children someday when we're ready. Something flickered across his face, surprise, then a tenderness that made her breath catch. Children, he repeated, as if testing the word. I'd like that too, Katie, more than I can say. The simplicity of his admission touched her deeply. Xander wasn't a man of flowery declarations or grand gestures. His love showed itself in steadfast actions. The lantern he always made sure had oil before he left, the shelves he'd built to hold her precious books, the garden plot he'd doubled in size, when he noticed her interest in growing herbs and flowers alongside their vegetables. Well then, she said, rising to gather their plates, we'd best get to work making this place ready for little ones, hadn't we? His smile was answer enough. The weeks that followed settled into a comfortable routine. Xander secured the mail contract, which brought a welcome regularity to their finances. Thomas Peterson joined them 3 days a week, his youthful energy and genuine interest in learning the ranching business making him a valuable addition. Katherine found herself watching Xander more closely during this time, noting the way his shoulders seemed to carry less tension, how his rare laughs came more frequently. The certainty of returning home each evening rather than spending weeks on the trail had changed something fundamental in him. He moved with purpose around their small ranch, making improvements with an eye toward the future, reinforcing the cabin's roof against winter storms, expanding the root cellar, planning a second room to be added in the spring. One evening in late October, as the first true cold snap of autumn settled over the land, Katherine sat by the fire mending one of Xander's shirts while he cleaned his rifle at the table. The domesticity of the moment struck her suddenly how far they'd come from their tentative beginnings, when they'd been strangers bound by nothing more than written promises and desperate hope. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly, the question slipping out before she could reconsider. Xander looked up, his hands stilling on the rifle barrel. "Regret what?" "Sending for a bride you'd never met, taking such a risk." He set the cleaning rod down carefully and turned to face her fully. "Do you regret answering?" Katherine shook her head. "No, never that." She set her mending aside. "But I wonder sometimes if you got what you hoped for, if I'm—" She paused, searching for words. "If I'm enough for this life." Xander's brow furrowed as he rose and crossed to kneel beside her chair. "Katie, look at me," he said, his voice low and serious. When she met his gaze, he continued, "I wrote asking for a practical woman who wouldn't mind hard work and simple living. What I got was a partner braver than most men I know, smart enough to keep us from starving that first winter, and stubborn enough to stick it out when half the homesteaders around us gave up and headed back east." His hand found hers, warm and calloused. "And beautiful enough that I sometimes forget to breathe when I look at you," he added, a faint flush coloring his weathered cheeks. Katherine felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "Even covered in garden dirt and chicken feed." "Especially then," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smile, "because that's when you look most like you belong here, with me." She leaned forward to press her forehead against his. "I do belong here with you." Winter descended on the Wyoming Territory with its customary ferocity, bitter cold, howling winds, and snow that transformed the landscape into an endless white expanse. The mail route became more challenging, with Xander often returning home chilled to the bone despite layers of wool and leather. Katherine took to keeping the lantern burning from mid-afternoon onward, a beacon against the early darkness and swirling snow. December brought news that the Petersons would be hosting a Christmas gathering, inviting the scattered homesteaders and ranchers within a 20-mile radius. Such social occasions were rare treasures in the isolated lives of frontier families, and Katherine found herself unexpectedly giddy at the prospect. "We should bring something," she told Xander as they prepared for bed one night. "Mrs. Peterson will have enough cooking to do without providing everything." "Your apple preserves," Xander suggested immediately. "They're better than anything in the territory." Katherine laughed, pleased by his obvious pride in her cooking. "And maybe I could finish that quilt for little Sarah." "Her birthday's right after Christmas, isn't it?" Xander nodded, watching as Katherine brushed her hair, the firelight turning it to molten copper. "You've been working on that for weeks. When do you find the time?" "While you're on the mail route," she admitted. "The house gets too quiet otherwise." Something in her tone made him set aside the book he'd been reading, one of the few luxuries they allowed themselves. "You get lonely," he said. It wasn't a question. Katherine shrugged, setting down her brush. "Sometimes, but it's nothing like before when you'd be gone for weeks." Xander was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Come spring, we should think about getting you a proper horse. Not just old Daisy for garden work and fetching water, something you could ride into town now and then or over to visit the Peterson women." The suggestion surprised her. "You wouldn't mind?" "Mind?" He looked genuinely puzzled. "Why would I mind you having more freedom to move about?" "Some husbands would," she said carefully. "They'd expect their wives to stay home tending house." Xander's expression softened. "Katie, you're not some hothouse flower I'm keeping locked away. You're my wife, my partner in everything. If you want to ride into town or visit neighbors when I'm gone, you should be able to." His understanding touched her deeply. It was one of the countless ways he'd surprised her over their years together, his willingness to see her as a person with her own needs and desires, not merely an extension of himself or the household. "I'd like that," she said, slipping into bed beside him. "A horse of my own." The Christmas gathering at the Petersons proved to be even more enjoyable than anticipated. Nearly 30 people crowded into the modest farmhouse, bringing food, music, and news from the outside world. Katherine found herself drawn into conversation with Rebecca Henderson, the 19-year-old daughter of the rancher whose breeding stock Xander hoped to purchase. "Father says Mr. Graves has been asking about our heifers," Rebecca said as they helped arrange platters of food on the Petersons' dining table. "He's impressed with how your husband has built up his operation, starting from nothing like he did." Katherine smiled, pleased by the compliment to Xander's hard work. "We're hoping to expand our herd this spring. Your father's cattle are known for their hardiness." "They are that," Rebecca agreed proudly. Then, lowering her voice, she added, "And father mentioned he might be willing to offer favorable terms, considering how Mr. Graves helped when those rustlers came through last summer." This was news to Katherine. "Rustlers? Xander never mentioned helping your father with rustlers." Rebecca looked startled. "Oh, I thought," she stopped, clearly uncomfortable. "Perhaps I misunderstood," but Katherine knew she hadn't. It explained Xander's delayed return from the cattle drive, the explanation of taking the long way around that had seemed oddly vague at the time. He hadn't wanted to worry her with the danger he'd faced. Across the room, Xander stood deep in conversation with James Henderson and Sheriff Miller, his tall frame easy to spot among the gathering. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, meeting her eyes with a questioning smile. Katherine gave a small shake of her head, saving her questions for when they were alone. The evening continued with music from Thomas Peterson's fiddle, groups singing of Christmas carols, and an impromptu dance in the cleared space of the main room. Katherine watched with delight as elderly Mrs. Thompson instructed the younger women in the steps of dances popular in her youth, while the men looked on with varying degrees of trepidation. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Graves?" Xander's voice came from behind her, startling Katherine from her observations. She turned to find him holding out his hand, an uncharacteristically playful light in his eyes. "You don't dance," she reminded him. "For you, I'll make an exception," he replied, the corner of his mouth lifting in that half-smile that still made her heart skip. The dance was simple, a circular pattern that brought couples together and apart in rhythmic succession. Xander moved with surprising grace for a man who spent most of his life on horseback, his hand warm and steady at Katherine's waist. "You've been keeping secrets from me, Mr. Graves," she said quietly as they turned together, his steps faltered slightly. "Have I?" Rebecca Henderson mentioned rustlers, and how you helped her father last summer. Xander's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "It wasn't worth mentioning. It was dangerous enough that you were 3 days late coming home," Katherine countered, keeping her voice low despite the indignation rising within her. "That merits mentioning, I think." The music shifted, momentarily separating them as they moved to different partners in the dance pattern. When they came together again, Xander sighed, relenting. "Henderson's youngest boy rode into Casper while I was there, looking for help. A gang had hit their north pasture, driven off nearly 30 head. The sheriff was away tracking another group, so a few of us went after them." His jaw tightened. "They didn't go quietly." Katherine felt cold despite the warmth of the crowded room. "You could have been killed." "But I wasn't," he said simply, "and we recovered most of Henderson's cattle." "That's not the point, Xander," she insisted. "We promised not to keep things from each other, not the important things." He was quiet for a moment, guiding her through another turn before responding, "You're right. I should have told you." His eyes, earnest in the lamplight, held hers. "I didn't want you worrying about something that was already over and done." Katherine understood his reasoning, even as she disagreed with it. Xander had spent his life shouldering burdens alone, making his way in a harsh world that offered little clemency for weakness. Sharing his concerns, his fears, didn't come naturally to him. "I worry anyway," she told him softly. "Every time you're late. Every storm that blows in while you're on the trail, but I'd rather know the truth than imagine 1,000 worse possibilities." Xander nodded slowly, accepting her words. "No more secrets then," he promised, "even the difficult ones." The dance ended, couples breaking apart as Thomas struck up a livelier tune. Xander kept hold of Katherine's hand, drawing her toward a quieter corner of the room. "There is one more thing I haven't told you," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Katherine felt a flicker of apprehension. "What is it?" To her surprise, a smile spread across his face, genuine and unguarded. "Henderson's willing to let us have 5 of his best heifers and that young bull he brought in from Colorado. In exchange for helping with the rustlers, he's offering them at half what they're worth." Relief and joy surged through Katherine in equal measure. "Xander, that's wonderful. That's exactly what we need to expand the herd." "That's not all," he continued, his eyes bright with barely contained excitement. "The railroads confirmed they'll be laying track through Potter's Creek by late spring. We'll be able to ship directly from there, just like I hoped." Katherine squeezed his hands, understanding the significance of this news. The railroad would transform their operation, eliminating the need for long, dangerous cattle drives and opening markets that had previously been inaccessible. "Everything's coming together," she breathed, hardly daring to believe it. Xander nodded, his expression solemn despite the happiness evident in his eyes. "We've worked hard for this, Katie, both of us, and there's still plenty of work ahead. But I think," he paused, seeming to search for the right words, "I think we're building something real here, something good." The understated declaration, so typical of Xander's straightforward nature, filled Katherine with warmth. She reached up to touch his face, no longer seeing the exhausted, dust-covered cowboy who'd returned from the cattle drive months ago, but the man who'd become the center of her world, steadfast, honorable, and hers. "We are," she agreed simply. "Something very good indeed." The winter months passed slowly, punctuated by blizzards that sometimes kept Xander home for days, the mail route impassable even for the most determined rider. These unexpected reprieves from their normal routine became treasured intervals, time for long conversations by the fire, for planning the spring planting, for simply being together without the constant press of chores and obligations. In February, a particularly vicious storm struck, howling around their cabin for 3 days straight. On the second night, as wind rattled the shutters and snow piled against the doors, Katherine woke to find Xander standing at the window, staring out into the swirling darkness. "What is it?" she asked, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders as she joined him. He turned slightly, acknowledging her presence without taking his eyes from the window. "Just thinking about how different things might have been." "Different how?" He was quiet for a moment, his breath fogging the glass. "Do you remember that first winter you were here? That December storm that nearly took the roof off?" Katherine nodded, the memory still vivid despite the passage of time. The blizzard had struck without warning, catching Xander out checking fence lines. He'd barely made it back to the cabin, half frozen and disoriented in the whiteout conditions. "I was so scared," she admitted. "I kept that lantern burning all night, even though I knew you couldn't possibly see it through the storm." Xander turned to her fully then, his expression thoughtful. "But I did see it," he said quietly. "Just before I lost all sense of direction, that tiny point of light was the only reason I found my way home." Katherine stared at him, stunned by this revelation. "You never told me that." "I was too proud, I think," he said, a rueful smile crossing his face. "Too ashamed of how close I'd come to dying from my own stubbornness, being out in weather I knew was turning." He reached out to touch her cheek, his fingers warm against her skin. "That light in the window, that was the moment I knew for certain I loved you. Not just because you were my wife, or because you'd kept your part of our bargain, but because even when it seemed hopeless, you still kept that light burning for me." The simple declaration, spoken in the intimacy of their darkened cabin with only the banked fire providing dim illumination, struck Katherine to her core. Xander wasn't given to romantic declarations or poetic language. His love showed itself in actions: the fence he'd built around her garden to keep rabbits out, the books he sometimes brought back from his mail runs, knowing her love of reading. "I've always kept it burning," she said softly. "Every time you're away, it's my promise to you." He drew her closer, his arms encircling her with gentle strength. "And I've always come home to it, that's my promise to you." As spring approached, bringing with it longer days and the first tentative shoots of green across the prairie, Katherine found herself filled with a new sense of anticipation. The plans they'd laid during the winter months were coming to fruition. Henderson's cattle would arrive in April. The railroad construction at Potter's Creek was proceeding on schedule, and Thomas Peterson had agreed to work for them full-time once the busy season began. Most exciting to Katherine was Xander's promise to take her to Cheyenne once the spring roundup was complete. It would be her first visit to the territorial capital, a journey of nearly 100 miles that would require several days' travel each way. The prospect of seeing a real city again, with shops and theaters and crowds of people, filled her with childlike excitement. "We'll need supplies anyway," Xander had reasoned when suggesting the trip. "Might as well make an adventure of it." Now, as March winds gave way to April's more temperate breezes, Katherine stood in their dooryard, watching as Xander worked with a spirited chestnut mare he'd brought home the previous week. "She's got good bloodlines," he was explaining as the horse circled the corral, testing the limits of the long lead rope. "Henderson bred her from that stallion he brought in from Kentucky 2 years back." Katherine leaned against the corral fence, admiring the mare's sleek lines and alert expression. "She's beautiful, but she looks like she has a mind of her own." Xander chuckled, a rare sound that still made Katherine's heart lift whenever she heard it. "That she does. Reminds me of someone else I know," he added with a meaningful glance in her direction. Katherine felt her cheeks warm at the gentle teasing. "Are you saying I'm stubborn, Mr. Graves?" "Determined," he corrected, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Independent, spirited. All qualities I admire greatly." The mare chose that moment to toss her head and prance sideways, as if agreeing with his assessment. Xander adjusted the rope skillfully, maintaining control without forcing the animal's compliance. "Is she for the ranch?" Katherine asked, wondering if Xander intended to use the mare for working cattle or perhaps breeding. He shook his head, his expression turning serious. "She's for you, Katie, if you want her." Katherine's breath caught in her throat. "For me, truly." Xander nodded, his focus still partly on the horse as she circled. "I said you needed a proper mount, remember? Not just old Daisy for hauling water. This one's young enough to serve you well for many years, but not so green she'll give you trouble." The thoughtfulness of the gift, not just any horse, but one specifically chosen to match Katherine's experience and needs, moved her deeply. It represented freedom, independence, the ability to travel into town or visit neighbors without relying on Xander's presence or assistance. "She's perfect," Katherine said, meaning it. "What's her name?" Henderson called her Penny for her color, Xander replied, "but you can change it if you like. She's yours now." Katherine studied the mare, who had settled somewhat and was now eyeing them both with cautious interest. "Penny suits her, I think. When can I start working with her?" "Today, if you'd like. She needs to get used to your voice, your touch." For the next hour, under Xander's patient guidance, Katherine began the process of building trust with the mare. By sunset, Penny was allowing Katherine to stroke her neck and withers, accepting gentle touches with only occasional nervous sidesteps. "She'll come around," Xander assured her as they walked back to the cabin in the gathering twilight. "Just needs time to understand you won't hurt her." Katherine nodded, thinking of her own gradual adjustment to frontier life, how she'd needed time to trust this new world and her place in it. "Don't we all?" Xander glanced at her, something unreadable passing through his eyes. "Some of us take longer than others," he said quietly. "Some of us need a light in the window to guide us home." Katherine slipped her hand into his, understanding the deeper meaning behind his words. "Then it's a good thing I keep that lantern filled with oil," she replied, "for as long as you need it." As they reached the cabin, the first stars appearing in the deepening blue sky above, Katherine felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. This life they'd built together, challenging and sometimes lonely, but rich with purpose and shared dreams, was everything she hadn't known to hope for when she'd first agreed to marry a stranger in a distant territory. The cowboy had indeed ridden home late and weary that autumn night months ago, and she had left a lantern burning to guide his way. But what had started as simple practicality, a light against the darkness, had become something more profound, a symbol of their enduring commitment to find their way back to each other, no matter what storms life might bring. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their home, Katherine traced the line of Xander's jaw with gentle fingers. "When we go to Cheyenne," she said softly, "I want to find a special lantern, something beautiful that will last for years." Xander caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "What's wrong with the one we have?" "Nothing," she assured him, "but I want something that will still be burning in our window 20 years from now, something our children and grandchildren will know means love and safe return." His arms tightened around her at the mention of children, a dream they both carried close to their hearts. "Then we'll find the finest lantern in all of Wyoming Territory," he promised, "and keep it burning for all the years to come." As spring blossomed into summer, and summer faded into autumn once more, the lantern continued to shine from their window whenever Xander rode the mail route or tended to distant parts of their expanding ranch. A beacon of constancy in a land where little could be taken for granted. A silent promise between a woman who waited and a cowboy who always returned, weary perhaps, but never too tired to be grateful for the light that guided him home to love.